Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless, the podcast that teaches you how to live a healthier lifestyle that makes you and the planet happier. The world is changing quickly. Sometimes it feels like you can't keep up. I hear you. You want to make the world a better place, you care, but you don't know where to start. You know taking care of yourself is important, but how? I get it. I have a history of diving into a new endeavor seeking perfection and quickly feeling like I failed. Whether it was going vegan or learning how to recycle more, I wish I had guidance to keep me on track and not overwhelmed. I can't lie, the world needs your help. But it doesn't need you to be perfect. This podcast is here to help. Here we go. On today's episode, I talk to fellow coach and vegan podcaster Michele Olender. I'm glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Carly. Well, it's my absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
So I like asking people when I get them on the podcast, how are you feeling today? A little bit more conscious, a little bit more clueless, something in between. What does that mean to you today?
Well, I'm a Gemini. I feel like it's always in between. I'm always like, well, and on the other hand, but I think consciousness is something I try to keep reorienting myself towards, but I find myself typically clueless. But it's like that North Star, or what they say that, the airline pilot is most of the time, 90% of the time he's off course, but he keeps tweaking it back, or the autopilots on it just move it back onto course. For me, trying to keep in my head what I'm trying to be conscious about and what I'm trying to be conscientious about. It's a practice, like yoga, like a spiritual practice, like practicing showing up as a good partner or a friend or community member. So no one's great at any of these things all the time. At least I'm not. And so it's just like that taking that minute to like, okay, where could I be a little bit more conscious right now?
I love that. Bringing that attention, because sometimes we are so kind of out of body, right? Walking through the world, dealing with the things that we have to deal with and not totally tuned in. And then it's like all of a sudden, sometimes when you've been ignoring that, your body, your soul, your mind is like screaming at you to pay attention.
Exactly. Or someone in your life, or someone who feels very neglected, or someone, I have a brother, I have friends, I have classmates from college, 40 years in the past. And every once in a while, there's just like this, like, hello.
Yeah,
So from the
totally.
universe, as well as from a human being that would like you to reorient your focus a little bit.
I love that example with the pilot too. I love a visual. And that's such a good visual of, well, there's just always a bit of a redirect.
Because there's wind, there's jet stream, there's things they're trying to avoid, I guess, up there at 35,000 square feet, or 35,000 feet, not square feet. So there's and my kids all learn to sail. And for me, sailing is always such a beautiful metaphor for everything, because there's the conditions on the water are never the same 2 days in a row ever. So you have the wind, you have the current, you have waves, you have the heat and your ability, how dehydrated you are out there. And you have the tiller and you have a sail, and you have to just keep kind of working with it. And sometimes you have an oar that you have to end up paddling because there's no wind whatsoever. So ultimately we all get where we're going.
Right.
Sometimes we have to ask for help.
I like that as well too, right? Because you're just constantly being reminded to push your focus back in that direction. Because it's like as soon as you kind of lose the thread, I think that has happened more for me in the past, as I would be doing really well and being like, yep, I'm doing my habits. I'm on top of all my things that I know I'm doing. And as soon as you feel like you're doing well, you kind of like let it go a little bit. And that's the moment where you're like, oh, whoops, I need a redirect because I stopped paying attention.
And Carly, I don't think, from my perspective, I don't think we're supposed to get it all right. I think we're supposed to be on a little bit, roller coaster, maybe not, but we're supposed to be on a little bit of a meandering path where we do take a few things for granted here and there. And then so that we can focus on something else that needs doing. But then we have to, reorient back and double back. And sometimes we have to jettison some things
Right.
we're carrying and taking care of. I know for me, that's something I feel at my point in life, I need to be very conscious of whether I want to take some things forward. Are there
Mm,
some within the privilege I have and the opportunities I have, there's still some stuff I've taken on for good reasons. And I have to always reevaluate. Do I want to keep doing that? My mom
yeah.
told me before I got married years ago, my mom said, don't iron. You don't plan on ironing. And I think she meant ironing. I really do think she meant ironing, but I think it was, I think it was good advice to think about anything you start your relationship doing, which kind of you're creating the baseline, right?
Right.
And so don't iron and iron and iron and then just go, I don't want to iron anymore. Why do you expect me to iron? It's because you did. You ironed. You so
Yeah.
I think that there are times when you can say, listen, whether it's ironing or whether it's, you know, helping out in certain areas that you've done to be a good sport, but you don't really want to do anymore. And you think maybe that's the other person's job to figure that part out now. Or maybe
Right.
it's just things that I thought were important. I used to think it was really important for me to figure out like my look, my grooming and my clothing and
Hmm.
I used to think that was really important. And it used to be very kind of hard on myself, thinking I've never really figured that out. And I just really don't care anymore. I realized that the reason that's been a struggle is it's just not ever going to be on the top part of my interests.
I had that kind of realization. I love to put a cute thrifted outfit together and do that kind of stuff. I never really loved doing, like I did it, but never doing like lots of hair and makeup growing up. But that was very much the norm, of course, and it was the early 2000s, so everyone was straightening their hair to all get out, which I lucked out on that one. This is just what it does. But I remember having this weird kind of like, do I have to like this? But I didn't really allow myself to even ask that question until mid-college.
Mm.
And it's not because this person said, I don't want to see you wake up unless you're beautiful. But I remember when I was early college, the person I was dating, I remember being so self-conscious of just how I wake up in the morning that I would sneak out of bed and go fix my face and then get back into bed. And I'm friends with this person that's an ex from way years ago, and I told him that a couple years ago, and he was like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah, it wasn't you. It wasn't your fault." But that's how deeply that stuff is. And when you learn that that's really fun for some people and it doesn't have to be fun for you, man, is that a freeing experience.
Yeah, and at different time. So if you enjoyed it, that would be great. Like if you were
Yeah,
just like that, you woke up and you're like, okay, bingo, I'm gonna brush my teeth and I'm gonna be fresh and cute and blushy and bronzy and whatever else
I-
it is. That would be so fun. You should be able to do it.
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. But I was like, this isn't fun. I don't want to do this. It's just, and it's a small example and
It is
it's,
a
but
small,
it's,
but this is one of those things. I think that there are different, like there's the quarter life crisis and there's the midlife crisis. And, I think there at different times there are things that it's not just what you're going for, it's what you're willing to leave behind is
mm,
part of your thinking. Because otherwise you're dragging a lot
yeah.
forward and you just can't give everything your attention.
And it's harder to move forward when you're dragging that much shit behind you.
And sometimes, I mean, very often, I think women, especially older women, were socialized to try and tiptoe around everybody's different moods and what they need and be the caregiver and be the volunteer and the nurturing community member and carpool parent and soccer coach. And we're trying to do so many things.
Yep.
And it's good. It's not a bad thing, but not everybody even is noticing how much you're putting into it. And I remember as a younger mom also realizing that I was pretty extended and I would like practice in the mirror or in the shower going, yeah, no, I won't be able to do that. just to say, no, I won't be able to do that, because people would say, oh, can you be a volunteer on this? Or could you pick up my kid after school while we're away? Or, and I would just have to practice so that those words came out of my mouth a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
naturally, because my kind of default instinct was like, no, if you can, you should say yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Those boundaries, learning about boundaries. I mean, it's so cliche, and everyone on the TikTok and whatever else is talking about boundaries, but honestly, that is such an important thing to learn. What are your own boundaries? Whether it's, volunteering in the community, in a relationship, those things are so crucial to keep yourself safe and happy in any relationship.
Yeah, and we don't want to have our relationships, polluted by a lot of resentment and that sort of thing. Like, I don't want to resent somebody I'm trying to help or somebody I wanted to help. I don't want to resent them, and I really don't want them doing the same thing to me. My mom and I, when I was young, I didn't have like the most warm, fuzzy relationship with my mother. My mother and I became really very close, good friends later on in life. And I always think what a gift that I was able to, have that time so that it came to that point. But she always would say, oh, Michele, you can always count on Michele to just tell you the truth. And I remember when she said that, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't even know that that was something I'd be so glad she appreciates about me. And
Oh, wow.
I tell my kids, my adult kids, and they're all three of my kids are married. I want them to tell me the truth. I don't want them going along with something because they don't know how to say no, Michele, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Say it, just say it, just say it.
Yeah, and what a beautiful thing to give to your children in the relationship you have with them now too. That's such beautiful permission
Well,
too.
I hope. I mean, I'm sure at some point it'll come and bite me and they'll say something I really don't want to hear.
You're like, just kidding, that's too far.
When they
I
were
take it back.
when they were teenagers, I remember telling them, listen, someday you're going to have to tell me something you really don't want to tell me. And I want you to say, if it's really hard, I want you to say, Mom, you're going to get really mad. But so that would like give me, don't blindside me. Give me that 1 second to like steel myself.
Here we go.
And I'll say, yes, of course, it's okay if I'm mad. That's fine. But there are things
Right.
that it doesn't matter. I can be mad and we can still be glad we had the conversation.
Yes, gosh, what an important lesson. So we connected first because I was on your podcast, Veg Your Best, which listeners should go check that out. It has been really fun to go back through. And I wanted to, after chatting with you, wanted to talk about your vegan journey and talk about your coaching. So let's dive into some of that. What is your vegan story? How did you get to Veg Your Best?
My vegan story is in my 50s. My youngest was vegan for a while. And I remember being half supportive and half irritated.
Yep,
and
that sounds right.
and with a frisson of, oh my gosh, is that even healthy for you? Because
Yeah.
she was still like, I think she was still in high school, and definitely in the early years of college. She was still in high school still. And I didn't feel like she ate enough vegetables to be vegan. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
feel like she would had all that food coming in. So anyway, I tried to be at my at my level of consciousness then. I
Mm-hmm.
tried to be supportive. I tried to be helpful, and I started trying to learn how would she what like if we'd go out to eat, I think, how would she order here? What do I want? So anyway, this is always how I go. I try to figure out what is it I think before I give somebody else a hard time. So we would go
Mm-hmm.
out to dinner and I'd say, okay, what would I want from Olivia here? I would want her to order this side and ask for that. And so I started to do that. I started at restaurants with my husband, even before I even really thought that much about it. I said I would order as I would hope my daughter would be able to order. And if a restaurant gave me a hard time, I'd say, well, I have a vegan daughter. Am I not going to bring her here if you can't make that? So I started to like be an advocate for the eating side of veganism before I really personalized it for me.
I just have to pause because I love this. Like, it's such a beautifully classic mom moment to be like, okay, my kid is doing this thing, and this is what we hope, right? A hope of, and I got to figure this out. Is she going to survive? Okay, let me see if I can do this. Well, are they not going to feed her? You're not going to feed my daughter? Like, I just love that that's the place you started. It's so beautiful.
Well, it is exactly what happened. And my husband didn't want to do it for himself, but he was, I think, very indulgent. Like, no, Michelle is, bringing this restaurant, all the staff are coming out and explaining why they can't do it that way. So anyway, it gave me the power to go through it. And the other thing I started to do was I started to listen to podcasts about veganism. And that's fast forward, that's where I became a podcaster is back then, because I thought it was the most valuable information that I got was listening to a bunch of different podcasters talking about how they individually went through this. The issue was most of them were men, most of them were really athletes. Now, my daughter was a squash player, but I started to think, okay, well, if, an ultra endurance athlete seems to be able to get enough protein, I guess Olivia can play can play college squash. I don't know. I mean, I was thinking like that. So that kind of put myself a little bit more like, I guess it's possible. It still needs to be
Mm,
done carefully. It's still not going to be simple, but it can be done. And in the long run, each of those kind of practices of looking into it, asking for it, advocating, researching when it wasn't even me, when it was for someone else, I started to think, oh, well, this is actually pretty manageable. This is pretty doable. And it's why, fast forward for Veg Your Best, I think what keeps people from making the decision earlier and more frequently to go vegan or to get close to a vegan lifestyle is they just can't imagine how it's going to work. They just can't
yeah,
visualize the process.
yeah. And so you decided then for health reasons, was that primary focus at that point, would you say, or had anything other
I
dominoes toppled yet?
Oh yeah, I think there were more dominoes than health. I think health, I didn't really have any health concerns, so I wasn't particularly worried about that. I was worried about my daughter not fueling herself well enough.
Right.
I didn't feel like I was going to have that level of problem fueling myself. I started to just think we hear by osmosis why other people had made their decisions. The climate and the environment mattered a lot. I mean, that seemed very obvious that very quickly that was something you're actually no longer contributing to.
Right.
And then the issue of animals, I could see how I had, because I was very socialized to eat what's on your plate, just eat it and be glad you have it. My parents,
Mm-hmm.
my mom grew up poor in the Depression. My dad was a refugee in the Second World War,
Wow.
homeless child. So, I mean, the idea of food in my family was very much like, I mean, we didn't suffer with food, but it was like, no, you just eat it.
You be
So
grateful.
be grateful, yeah, because I knew all these people I knew really well did not have adequate food as young people.
So
So it
how
was
should
just
you
kind of,
even question anything when you're just supposed to be like, well, at least I have food. My parents
yeah,
didn't.
exactly. And it was just very much disconnected with the idea of an industrial animal agricultural system, completely disconnected. But with every time I chose not to eat animal products, I found it a little bit more, let's say simple. I just found it a little more accessible to think, well, I would never choose to watch the light go out of the eyes of an animal. I would never choose that.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's going to keep my child alive, that would be a choice. But if it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessary, why have I gotten so comfortable choosing that or letting
Right.
somebody else choose that? So, and that's another thing with my work. I think when I don't believe there are too many people who want an animal to die for their a food,
Agreed.
especially for food that they won't remember, that they're not, that's not keeping them alive, that's just
Mm-hmm.
unconsciously consumed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think sometimes we just need that space in the synapses between our decision making and the consequences of those decisions. We just need a little space. And most of us are busy, busy, busy with a lot of other things and people and interactions and bills and crises that we just don't give ourselves that space.
I think that that is such a big thing that I'm sure we've both heard is this idea of time. That there is not enough time to, like you said, if you can't even imagine this being a reality for your life, you certainly can't imagine having the time to do it. And so once you kind of started learning about this for your daughter and then ultimately going, maybe I could do this, how long was that? Did you kind of take your time in that journey
I would
or?
say I've called myself, I was a practicing excusitarian. I was vegan, plant-based. Plant-based was not a term at that point that I recall having heard. I feel like that's a little bit
Mm,
more recent term, but I considered it, I was vegan in those choices in food, unless there was a real problem, a less real issue. Like maybe I was visiting my mother at her assisted living or
mm,
something, and it was just impossible to get something. Coleslaw, I couldn't get coleslaw, but they only had the one with the, dairy in it or something like that. That kind of thing. So I was
right.
typically, but most of the time I was making those choices. But if the choice didn't seem very doable, I just looked the other way. That was my
Right.
excusitarianism. And at some point, my husband wanted to see if I mean he had seen me making more and more of these choices, and he knew I was moving in that direction. He was trying to lower his cholesterol. Doctor was saying, "Oh, you should try statins." Da, 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 da. So anyway,
Ugh.
at that point, when he was moving in that direction, I said, "Listen, I'm I'm just not going to eat animal products anymore. I just don't see any reason to." And it was sort of me being kind, not a model, more of a, you make more of those choices and I will in solidarity not make any of those animal choices anymore. Again, I always call it hiding behind my family. I somehow had to feel like it was going to help someone in my family for
Mm-hmm.
me to make those choices or make those changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is one thing that most of my most of my clients are people, 45 plus and older. It's a lot of us have this train we're on with other people. Maybe we have kids or grandkids or family or older people we're taking care of. And now we're like, oh wait, am I changing all the rules? I'm
Right.
changing. There's no more eggs in the morning. There's no more milk on the cereal. There's no more. Am I just changing all the rules here? And it can feel really daunting because you don't think it's just your choice.
Yeah, and I think that that space and that remembering that is crucial for a lot of things, not to excuse people that are doing bad things or whatever, but the longer you are socialized to think this is correct, X is correct, Y is correct, then the potentially, I think, more time it takes to unravel. And that I know I can forget that. I think it's easily forgotten, but there is something to that, that it might be a different conversation with my 95-year-old grandfather about gender than it is with a peer. And it's not that he would never see that or whatever it is, but he's got 95 years to unravel of thinking a certain way. And that's a lot,
Yeah.
So there is something to be said about the longer you have been doing these things and the longer you've thought that to be truth. Like, if this food is good for me, that's what I know. I've known it, those things can be really earth shattering.
Dr. Melanie Joy talks about the three N's, that animal products are natural, normal, and necessary. And I for sure grew up thinking that,
Yep.
for sure. My mother thought milk was the perfect food. Now, I had a lactose intolerance as a kid. I used to go to school. She'd make me drink a glass of milk before school, my poor mom. And I, that I would just have awful tummy issues.
I'm
And
sure.
we went to my pediatrician. The pediatrician said, you really probably have a lactose intolerance issue, especially a glass of milk on an empty stomach. You're probably, that's probably it. And my mom just smiled and listened. She was a nurse and married to a doctor. And we walked out of there. My mom went, that is such nonsense.
She's like, here's your milk.
Here's your milk. Shut up and drink it.
Yeah, here's your milk. Right, because she's like, that's not what I know to be true my whole life.
Yeah.
So why would it be true right now? And when you have those reactions with people, and when people are working with you because you're a coach, they're, they're willingly coming to you to make these changes. But when you have people have those responses of like, well, it's always been this way. Why now? What do you say? What are your reactions?
Well, I guess more often it's the people who come to me are getting that reaction from their partners or colleagues or parents or kids. They're like, and in my opinion, not as a health professional, as long as you don't seem to have any actual physical thing that you're particularly worried about, just try it. Just
Right.
try it. Just let's move in that direction. If you have, that's the other thing that older people also have more likely to have developed some concepts of medicalization about their lives. They've started to think of
Interesting.
themselves as somehow, I think young people have it too in some ways, in different ways, but I noticed that a lot of middle-aged women start to think of themselves as somehow broken hormonally and broken, physically. And there's a lot of things so in those cases, I'm always first thing you have to do is talk to your healthcare provider and ask them, is it safe for you to start moving away from animal products? Because if you really have, and sometimes you have to advocate for yourself with doctors. I think doctors are way more open in the last 5 to 10 years than they were earlier. I think they're way more open to even my husband's primary care practitioner. He told him the other day that he's vegan till dinner and then he still eats fish. And he was expecting the doctor to go, well, that's not enough. He was like, oh, that's excellent. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Surprised. So
That's amazing.
So what's different, I think, is that at every point in your life, you have things that you are just practiced thinking. And going vegan in your 40s or 50s or 60s, I think is such an opportunity to say, oh, you mean I can have a slightly different life just by making different choices. What else am I talking myself out of? What else am I not advocating for in my life? Where else am I maybe less on the part of the acting as a solution and more acting in a way that's a problem?
Yeah.
We're so interconnected, and I think older people very often are more connected in many ways than young people. We have more of these relationships that we feel held together by. And so that can be a great thing. It also can be a thing where no one's really that interested in you changing.
Yeah, that is a really, really real thing. I don't know how else to say that, but when I went vegan, I was dating someone who wasn't vegan, was willing to eat if I was cooking, that was going to be what was being made, and was fine with that as long as they were getting enough food, kind of thing. But I think it became harder and harder for him to see that I was changing. And it's not that I was right or he was wrong or whatever it was, but I think that because we had been comfortable in this spot and one of us was going here and one of us wasn't, that became a lot of friction. And that doesn't just have to be veganism, of course. That can be change in relationships in a lot of ways. But when it's something that's central around food and you eat with your partner or your family 3 times a day, that's a big conversation to have with the people, at least in your household sometimes.
It is. And there is a subtext that other people hear when you choose to change, is that, well, then you must think I'm doing it
They're
wrong.
wrong. Absolutely. And it puts people on the defense, even when it's not your intention.
Yeah, it's just what happens. People think, oh, you think what you're doing is right, so that means just ipso facto, you must think I'm
Yeah.
doing it wrong. And that is really hard for people. And I think this is more where the idea of the angry vegan comes from, is from people. I mean, there are angry vegans, and there are vegans who are very not accepting. And I think it's one of the reasons why I love your work, is because I feel like you you bridge that space really nicely.
Thank
But
you.
I think people really do feel diminished, dismissed, condemned. And even if you've never said a word.
Yeah, yeah. And how do you navigate those conversations or those situations? Or what advice do you have for people that might be in that space?
Well, I think if I don't have any opinions about what other people should do unless they're finding it a problem. And
Mm,
then I would, because I think we all have to navigate it our own way, and the people around us all have different levels of comfort with all of it. But I would say, if you're finding it hard, consider making sure you're owning it as your own practice.
hmm
Now, some people don't like that. They think, well, why should I just look the other way about atrocities of any other kind? And there is a obvious excellent argument on that point, that you should not be accepting behavior you think is immoral. On the other hand, if you've been in a situation where you recently were making the same decisions as the people around you, and especially if you're an older person, yes, you probably, if you're this is new in your 40s, 50s, or beyond, you have been making those same. In fact, I raised my kids eating animal products, so
Right.
I've just felt that I can't speak for what other people should do in these
Right.
relationships. And I think that the most powerful thing I can do as a vegan is live in a way that shows my values, live in a way that tries to make it easier for more people to do that. And I have a sense of that there is some hypocrisy in terms of what my belief is and what I accept. But I also think that this world is so not vegan currently that we need to kind of develop that level of veganism as the vegan next door, and the vegan in your family, and the somebody who's actually living in the life that you could be living and
Right.
making those choices. We need to be visible, not separated.
Right. Yeah. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's not
When,
perfect. It's not perfect. I remember I was on a podcast, one of my first podcasts that I was on earlier in my coaching work, and they said, "Well, uh, how are you okay with your husband not being vegan?"
mm,
And I remember I was not prepared for the question. I remember thinking, well, I mean, we've been married 30 plus years. I guess it wasn't on the list of things I could expect for somebody else to have to do the same way. Never
yeah.
occurred to me. I know some people found my answer very unsatisfactory. I found it unsatisfactory too. Because I don't even know what to say. I know my conscience, I have to live in my life, not
Yeah.
other people's.
Well, and one thing I appreciate about the space that you have made and your podcast is that you're right. I noticed the same thing when I was diving into learning about veganism. I was listening to podcasts, and a lot of it was athletic men talking about nutrition, and love that. That's a good, there's a space for that, but it definitely felt very male. And now I, at that point, was in my mid 20s. So I am not noticing that everyone else is younger like me because, I'm in it. But even just now I'm realizing how there is, like in anything, an erasure of older people. And by older, probably past like 37 at this point on the internet. And not only that, but women. And so I really appreciate that your intention is showing, that women in their 50s can make these choices about their health and go vegan, even if that seems like something that's totally crazy.
Well, I like to think of it as there's nothing more powerful than a woman in her, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I just think so many
Yes.
people tell me, so many young people, you hear them say, well, I could be vegan, but my mom's against it. What am I going to do when I go to my grandmother's? Like, what if I'm a babcia, not a grandma, I'm a babcia, but it's Polish for grandma. So what if grandma is like all on board with your veganism? What if grandma is all on board with, even if she's not a perfect vegan, that you're making those choices? What if she's proud of you for thinking about where the food comes from and what that means for the climate? What if grandmother's really concerned about what life is going to be like for, I have a almost 4-year-old grandson and three others, behind him. I'm concerned about all these things, about the quality of the food, about the quality of the air and the water. All these things, I think if grandma was on board and not this stereotypical, you can't talk to her, grandma, for some reason, how is it grandma's got to this reputation of being like stuck in the mud and we have to do everything the same way we did in 1921? I don't know where that came from.
I don't know. I am sorry.
I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of us that are very stuck in the mud, but my role is to try to encourage us to do it wrong, because a lot of us are older. We're like, oh, really? Am I going to do this thing that I'm going to be judged on for not being 100% in alignment? I mean, when I started going vegan, I did not deal with the wool in my closet. I did not deal with the leather of my shoes. I didn't deal with that. I still have I'm basically out of wool. It's basically all been given away, but I still have a few leather things. They just
I'm
don't get
down to my
replenished.
last 2 pairs of wool socks, I think, that haven't worn out in the last however many years. Because I'm like, I own them. I'm not going to waste them now. And that can be an unpopular opinion as well.
It is. It is. And I think this is where we need to think for ourselves from our opened, consciousness. We want to keep opening for it, but is it conscious to just throw things away? Is it conscious to buy plastic? Is it unless it's necessary? I mean, we just want everything is on the table for us to make intelligent decisions about.
Yeah, I wish I would have had a little bit of guidance in the beginning of my kind of eco-friendly journey, vegan journey. It all kind of cascaded around the same. I started looking into for health, and then the environment, and it all quickly came in, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to change my entire life. And without having enough knowledge and wanting to do it perfectly, like I saw on the internet, which is why I eventually started a podcast where you didn't have to be perfect. But at the time, I threw away shit. I bought new stuff. I was like, here's my cute, aesthetically perfect mason jarred cabinet, which now, of course, I still have a bunch of them because I'm not going to get rid of them now. But I wasted so many things trying to be environmental. And because I was more attached to the image of it than what it was actually doing. And I think that goes with veganism too, right? The image of it, where it's like perfect and you're an activist on the street every day, and bless the people that do that. But that's not everyone's lane. And you can't, one of the first podcast interviews I ever did, this woman said, you can't be a perfect vegan in an unperfect world, or you can't be perfect in an unperfect world. And I always come back to that, because you can't, and that relieves some of the pressure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an evangelical Christian. I'm not even a practicing Christian, but I always hear people talk about how that's how Satan talks to you. Satan is the one telling you, oh, you making that choice? Well, that's not 100% how you think. That's not 100% what you do. And I always think that that's exactly how our own brains try to protect us from change, because change is biologically exhausting. Nobody, our bodies don't want us to change a lot of things. That's a lot to learn. So if I have to wait until I've got it all figured out, wait until I'm ready to get rid of everything leather or wool, get rid of, I have pillows that date from my parents' marriage. I just read the other day, you have to get rid of pillows after like 5 years. I'm like, are you kidding me? Mine are like 50 years old. So
Mine are somewhere between 5 and 50.
And some of them have feathers in them. And
Yeah.
so I have not, I mean, I still have a couple down coats that pre-exist my going vegan. I haven't gotten rid of them. Other things I have gotten rid of, like Uggs. I don't have Uggs anymore. I can't deal with that. But anyway, so all these things, if the devil told you you can't do it until you do all of it, that to me, that's that kind of, you would know if you were seeing that in a movie, or if you were seeing that and reading that in a book, that this was somehow like crazy to think that way. But in our own lives, when we're dealing with the discomfort of change, discomfort of a new identity, trying on a new identity that is not, it's pretty obvious when you stop making animal choices, eating animals and buying animal products. It's pretty obvious to people around us pretty quickly, even if you don't say anything, which I do recommend people not say much in the beginning.
Oh, interesting. Can you say more about that?
If you were someone like myself who really doesn't want to be judged, was really thinking, oh my God, it's just another opportunity for me to do something wrong, and people make little comments about that sort of thing, really bugged me in the early days of people saying things about it. I run into people a lot who just like, even my daughter, I remember her thinking every once in a while, like my husband, if we would sit down at dinner at a restaurant, my husband, trying to be as effective and as helpful as possible, would say to the waiter, listen, my daughter's vegan. What would you suggest? And she just didn't want to get into it. She didn't want to have the conversation with the waiter. She didn't want to be singled out. I think a lot of people feel that way until we learn some kind of vocabulary and some fluency about advocating for ourselves, and actually learn, what do I actually want? Sometimes you don't even know what you want in the early stages of being vegan.
Right. Yeah, that's really good advice. Being able to, for me, it always comes back to your why. Why are you doing this? Whether it is for health, whether it was the animals, whether it was Earth, whatever it is, when you have at least a one-liner about, well, I'm doing this because, that starts to feel a little bit more empowering, but it can feel tricky. And then it makes you question your own decision when you're trying on that identity. If people question you and you don't necessarily have that confidence in it, you're like, well, should I be doing this? All these people are asking me questions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I remember, I like to travel a lot in Europe, and we go to France and Italy fairly often. I'm a frustrated art historian. I have my master's in art history, and my whole life is about like art history. So the way I deal with it is on vacation. And my one of my oldest, dearest friends lives in Paris, and I was asking her to help me out, make sure that I was asking effectively when I would be in France. How would I explain myself if I'm getting one of these blank-faced waiters just looking at me like I'm crazy? And I remember her saying, well, you could just say that you have a dairy allergy. And I remember thinking, I don't though. I don't.
But that's not the truth.
Yeah. And I was like, yes, that is probably not bad advice for a waiter who doesn't need to know anything, but might have been taught that he needs to be thoughtful about somebody with an allergy.
Yeah.
But I remember it just made me like, ugh, not bad advice, but I don't feel like I want to say that.
Because it probably didn't feel authentic.
It didn't. And it made, now, have I ever said it? I don't know if I have. I've said I can't eat dairy. I've said things like that, which often, if other people say, oh, you can't have that, I'm like, yes, I can. I just choose not to. So I'm on all sides of the issue. But words matter in terms of connecting you with your why, as you're saying. They matter
Mhm.
in terms of connecting you with your boundaries and your energy, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's really, really beautiful. What advice do you have for people who are older than 37 or whatever age I threw out earlier that are thinking about going vegan, have some of those concerns that you've mentioned about, specifically women being these caretakers, being the ones everyone relies on, and how to navigate that? What's some simple advice without necessarily working with you, but what
Yeah,
can you
no,
share?
yeah. I think the podcast is my way of like nobody has to pay for the podcast. They can just listen, and it's
Same.
just
Yeah.
a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of reason, a little bit of inspiration about why maybe a plant-based or a vegan lifestyle is actually much more doable than you think. And if you're already vegan, there are all kinds of cool things that vegans are doing out in the world I want to share with each other. But I think my advice is, and it's why I named it Veg Your Best, is to make the decisions that you can make. If and see, because I think it does get so much easier once you realize that you don't have to make every decision today,
Right.
because you will learn so much about what's hard. I mean, when people say, "Oh, that was really hard. I didn't know what to do, and so I ended up ordering cheese on it or something," I would say, and they're like, "You're probably mad." I'm like, "Of course I'm not mad. What would have made it possible to not order it? Like, why was that the easiest
Right.
decision?" That's going to show you so much. Was it because you didn't want to, like one time, so sometimes, you're sitting at a dinner and they bring you cheese and you said, no cheese. And I remember the last time that I was really tempted to just eat it with the cheese on it. Had been vegan a long time, but there was something I didn't want to hijack the dinner. That's how I saw it in my head. Was if we'd all been waiting, it would have been a slow dinner, everybody was starving, and they bring me mine, and there's cheese all over it, and I see it, and I'm like, and I felt a little bit of a panic, like, am I really going to now? Nobody else is going to want to eat. Nobody else is going to want to eat while they send it back and everything. And luckily, the server said, "Oh my gosh, that was a mistake." And she just whisked it away. So I didn't even have to. But I
Mm,
know, but these things are hard for people. They really
yeah.
are. I'm not immune to it.
Yeah. I think that that's also really good, and you do a really good job with this is reminding people of those moments that I think sometimes there's this perception, and again a lot of it is just the idea of online living, but so many people are just showing the highlights and how easy everything is, and there are moments that are going to be hard. To pretend that they're not is lying, so let's prepare ourselves for them and talk about how to get through those moments.
Absolutely. And the more you go through those, it's like, what's the word? I have grandkids now, and I remember people would say, "Oh, you traveled with your kids when they were little." And basically, I'd say, well, once someone has pooped through the diaper all the way up the back of then
Yep.
that happens, right? And you don't, it's terrible. It's not good. Nobody wants it, but yet we all get through it.
Yeah.
We learn. Maybe we're more prepared the next time. Maybe we call ahead next time. Maybe we have something else on hand. I mean, they're all things that we learn all the time with failure. And I think we somehow think when we try a new, especially something about food, I think this diet mentality of that,
Yes.
well, you do it
Yes.
right or you're wrong and you give up. So if
Oh,
if you just would stick with the things that you want, you want to eat more vegetables, you want to eat less animal products, you want to eat whatever, just stick with it. It will get so much easier.
yes, I love that. Sticking with what you want. What are you working towards? What are you pushing towards? That's really good advice.
Yeah, we have to learn to advocate for ourselves. And if it's an area where you haven't been asking for things, I used to get kind of bummed by people would say, "Oh, you're asking for all the vegan options." I mean, I get some of that once in a while from people, and much less now. But
Yeah, yeah.
so my best advice is to be prepared to do it poorly, just like anything else you would do. You don't get you don't get into a relationship when you know how to have a long-term 45-year relationship, right? You get into a relationship because you're motivated to make some sort of a connection or a long-term commitment to another human being. But that doesn't mean you're never going to goof it up. It doesn't mean you're ever going to, it's a process of learning. And it's a process of getting wiser when you can and asking forgiveness when you goofed. So it's a process, and it's like anything else, because you're not done with veganism. It's not like, oh, next week I'll be vegan. It's 3+ times a day. It's when you shop, it's when you travel, it's all these things that you're trying to do. It's a practice. You cannot do it perfectly. It just cannot be done perfectly.
I love that. Permission to mess it up.
And learn from it a little bit, not make it a whole thing that like, okay, autopsy time, what, postmortem, what did I do wrong? When did I know it? But just like what worked well, what didn't work well. Oh, let's avoid that when possible.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share with listeners?
Well, I just hope everybody will start a podcast, Carly, don't you?
Yes. I love it.
I think everybody should start a podcast because there's so many different points of view and we're all sharing. And I love all the vegan and plant-based podcasts. I love the people just sharing how we can help each other as much as possible. And I've learned about a lot of people through yours, and I'm very grateful that you exist and that you're creating a space. I think you're especially, everybody has to visualize a change. And if the person they see that's vegan looks very, very different from them, it's going to be a little bit harder. And I think you have to collect a few vegans and vegetarians and plant-based people. You have to kind of collect them intellectually before you can make those choices. And you might collect them through celebrities or TikTok. You might collect, but there's all kinds of ways. You kind of have to collect it so you can figure out how you're going to try it on.
Yeah, that's so true. How it will look for you. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was so fun.
Thank you. And I thank all the Carly listeners, all the consciously clueless listeners. Thank you for listening to me. And on the behalf of all your grandmothers and mothers, I want you to make good choices. And we support you, even if sometimes we look at you and go, what are you doing? We love you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the space that you're creating too. I'm so glad that we connected, and I'm excited to see how we can continue to collaborate in the future.
Me too.
If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode of Consciously Clueless. And for that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this new episode. And if you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or tag me and share in social media. Share this episode with others who may be interested in this topic. To get more resources, influence on topics covered, and bonus content, join the Consciously Clueless community over on Patreon at patreon.com/consciouslycarly. And don't forget, if you need help living more consciously, let's work together. Email me today. See you next Wednesday for a new episode.